The Gulf of Oman at 2 a.m. carries almost no light. The commercial shipping lanes to the north run their standard density of tanker traffic, each vessel's navigation lights marking its position in the darkness, with the slow, patient progress of vessels moving 18 to 20 knots through water that does not distinguish between peaceful commerce and anything else. The military traffic is less visible and more numerous than the commercial picture suggests. The passive sensors on a U.S. Navy cruiser operating in the central corridor of the Gulf can resolve contacts that the commercial AIS network never acknowledges, contacts that appear only as radar returns and thermal signatures in the collection systems of a vessel that has been designed to find exactly what other systems are designed to miss. The USS guided missile cruiser had been on station in the Gulf of Oman for 16 days, executing a persistent maritime security presence tasking that placed it in the commercial shipping corridor between the Strait of Hormuz and the line of longitude that marked the boundary between the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea proper. The tasking was not glamorous in the operational sense. It did not involve the high-intensity events that define deployments in the tactical record. It involved being present continuously in the corridor where being present communicated something to every vessel and every shore-based observation platform watching the maritime picture. Presence is its own form of communication in the Gulf of Oman, and a guided missile cruiser riding the shipping lane at 12 knots for 16 consecutive days communicates something specific and durable about the United States Navy's assessment of who operates in this water. At 2:14 a.m., the picture changed. The contact that appeared first was not on the surface search radar. It was in the electronic warfare suite, a brief low-power radio frequency emission on a frequency band that the electronic warfare officer's classification library associated with the control architecture of an unmanned surface vessel. The emission lasted 1.4 seconds and was not repeated immediately. The electronic warfare officer logged it, assigned it a source bearing of 031 degrees, and maintained focused collection on that bearing while initiating a cross-check against the surface radar picture in the same direction. The surface radar showed nothing. The bearing at 031 degrees, at the range that a 1.4-second emission at that power level would indicate, showed only the residual sea clutter return that populated the inner ring of the surface picture at 2:14 a.m. Whatever had emitted that signal was either too small for the surface radar to resolve as a discrete contact at that range, or it was designed to minimize its radar cross-section in exactly the way that would prevent easy detection by the same surface search systems that it was approaching. The intelligence picture that the cruiser's crew had been briefed on before this deployment had contained a section on Iranian unmanned surface vessel development that the crew had treated with appropriate seriousness, and that was now acquiring a tactical relevance that briefing room discussions do not fully prepare a watch team for. The IRGC had been publicly demonstrating unmanned surface vessel prototypes in its domestic military exhibitions since 2021, including configurations identified as one-way attack platforms, vessels with no provision for recovery, designed to carry explosive payloads to a target and detonate on contact. The platforms demonstrated publicly had ranged in size from rigid hull inflatable configurations to fiberglass-hulled vessels in the 5 to 8 meter length range, all with radar cross-sections small enough to defeat standard surface search radar at ranges below, which standard engagement timelines could not be compressed further. The briefing had rated the probability of IRGC unmanned surface vessel employment in a Gulf of Oman interdiction scenario as elevated, following 3 previous incidents in which suspected unmanned platforms had been detected and successfully engaged in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden theaters. None of that contextual knowledge made the 1.4-second emission on bearing 031 degrees at 2:14 a.m. less alarming to process in real time. The electronic warfare officer reported the emission to the tactical action officer at 2:14:22 a.m. The tactical action officer had the surface radar picture at maximum gain on the 031 degree bearing within 30 seconds. The commanding officer was in the Combat Information Center at 2:15 a.m., not called, present, because a commanding officer who understands the Gulf of Oman threat environment at this period in the deployment cycle does not maintain a rigid sleep schedule when the electronic picture is active and the watch is young. At 2:16 a.m., the emission repeated. Same frequency. Same bearing. Duration 2.1 seconds this time. The electronic warfare officer reported it immediately. The power level was slightly higher than the first emission, consistent with a transmitter that had been operating at minimum power for stealth and had briefly increased output, possibly for a guidance update or a course correction command, sent from a shore-based or vessel-based control station to a platform on approach. The surface radar picture on bearing 031 degrees showed nothing resolvable. The commanding officer directed the forward electro-optical and infrared camera suite to slew to bearing 031 degrees at maximum sensitivity at 2:16:31 a.m. The FLIR was optimized for detection of thermal signatures against the cooler sea surface. The exhaust heat of an internal combustion engine, the friction heat of a hull moving through water at speed, any thermal anomaly that deviated from the ambient temperature of the nighttime Gulf. The display showed sea surface clutter on bearing 031 degrees. Then, at 2:17:09 a.m., at a range estimated from the FLIR's focal geometry at approximately 4.8 nautical miles, a faint thermal return that the FLIR operator characterized in his report as consistent with a small internal combustion engine at low power moving on a southwest heading. Bearing 031 degrees. Range approximately 4.8 nautical miles. Thermal return consistent with a small engine. 2 radio frequency emissions at intervals associated with a guidance system update architecture. The picture, assembled from 3 separate sensor inputs in 3 minutes, was not ambiguous to any member of the watch team who had been briefed on Iranian unmanned surface vessel capabilities. The commanding officer activated general quarters at 2:17 a.m. The ship's company moved to battle stations with the efficiency of a crew that had drilled the evolution multiple times during the current deployment and understood that this particular general quarters activation at 2:17 a.m. in the Gulf of Oman was not a drill. At 2:18 a.m., the FLIR picture resolved further. Not one thermal contact on bearing 031 degrees. 3. The operator reported the additional contacts at 2:18:11 a.m., 3 distinct thermal returns spaced approximately 200 to 300 meters apart in a loose formation, all moving on similar southwest headings at estimated speeds between 18 and 24 knots. 3 small, low-signature, powered surface contacts approaching the cruiser from the northeast at speeds consistent with unmanned surface vessels configured for terminal attack profiles. 3 contacts, all bearing approximately 031 degrees, all inside 5 nautical miles. The tactical action officer requested engagement authority at 2:18:19 a.m. The commanding officer authorized rolling airframe missile engagements against all 3 contacts under the Hostile Act authorities, applicable to armed unmanned systems on direct approach vectors within 5 nautical miles of a U.S. Navy vessel at 2:18:24 a.m. 5 seconds between the request and the authorization. The commanding officer had been holding the authorization decision in continuous readiness since the first emission was reported at 2:14 a.m. The additional 4 minutes of sensor development had refined the picture sufficiently that the authorization, when it came, was a confirmation of an assessment already made rather than a decision made under pressure without adequate data. The RAM launcher had been in active standby since 2:15 a.m., its tracking radar attempting to resolve the thermal contacts into radar-trackable returns. The system's own K-band seeker, which operates in both passive infrared and active radar modes for terminal guidance, had been struggling to maintain continuous track on contacts whose radar cross-sections were at the boundary of its effective engagement envelope at these ranges. The FLIR had the contacts more clearly than the radar, and the engagement solution that the fire control system was working from was a hybrid of thermal tracking data and the intermittent radar returns that the contacts produced when their hulls oriented at angles that presented slightly more radar-reflective geometry to the system. The first RAM launched at 2:18:41 a.m. against the lead contact, the one with the smallest range and the most direct approach vector to the cruiser's hull. The launch sound was a single sharp report that traveled through the cruiser's hull and registered in every space below decks as a physical event distinct from any ambient sound the ship produced. The missile's motor ignited at safe separation distance, and the exhaust plume curved northeast across the dark sky, tracking the lead thermal contact on a closing intercept vector. The FLIR feed showed the missile's own thermal signature converging with the target contact's thermal signature in a frame of imagery that lasted 0.4 seconds before both disappeared. The intercept occurred at 3.1 nautical miles from the cruiser's hull. The detonation was small. Unmanned surface vessels of this class carry warhead sections whose explosive weight is measured in hundreds of kilograms rather than tons, but the detonation at sea surface at 3.1 nautical miles was visible on the FLIR as a bright thermal event above the waterline that lasted approximately 2 seconds before cooling to a debris scatter. The second ram launched at 2:18:48 a.m. against the second contact, which had altered its heading by approximately 12 degrees at the moment the first interception flash lit the sea surface ahead of it. The heading change was not random. It was a programmed evasion response triggered by the loss of the lead contact, a preloaded course deviation designed to break the geometric relationship between the original approach vector and whatever targeting solution was tracking the remaining contacts. The fire control system tracked the deviation through the ram's own seeker and updated the intercept solution in flight. The second interception occurred at 2.8 nautical miles. The detonation was larger than the first. The second vessel had been on a slightly more direct approach vector, and the warhead section's proximity to the ship's hull at the moment of detonation, while still outside any blast damage range, was close enough that the FLIR operator's report used the word significant to characterize the thermal event. The third contact had broken from its original heading at the moment the first interception flash occurred. It turned 40 degrees to the north, a much more aggressive evasion than the second contact had executed, and accelerated. The FLIR tracked the course change and the speed increase, the thermal return brightening as the engine output increased. The third contact was no longer on an approach vector toward the cruiser. It was on a heading that would take it northeast, back in the direction from which it had come. The tactical action officer assessed the third contact's new heading and speed against its fuel and range characteristics, estimated from the class of vehicle the FLIR profile was consistent with, and determined that the contact was withdrawing rather than repositioning for a secondary approach. He logged the assessment at 2:19:42 a.m. and recommended to the commanding officer that the third contact be tracked rather than immediately engaged, to preserve the engagement data and allow the contact to continue transmitting to its control station, while the electronic warfare suite collected the communications architecture it was using. The commanding officer concurred. The third contact was tracked. It transmitted 4 times over the following 9 minutes, each transmission on the same frequency band as the original emissions, each logged with timestamp and bearing precision, each contributing to the electronic warfare suite's picture of the control system architecture. After the 4th transmission, the contact's thermal return faded from the FLIR picture at a range of 11.4 nautical miles from the cruiser. Either the engine had been shut down, or the vessel had reached a recovery point where its control station had cut power to minimize its electronic signature now that the approach operation had failed. The electronic warfare officer's collection record of the 4 transmissions, assembled with the transmission interval timing and the frequency characteristics of each, produced a signal intelligence product whose value extended significantly beyond the tactical engagement that had generated it. The transmission architecture indicated a control system design with specific operational range and bandwidth characteristics that had not previously been documented in the Theater Electronic Order of Battle for Iranian Unmanned Surface Vessel Systems. The product was transmitted to 5th Fleet's intelligence team at 3:15 a.m. The commanding officer secured general quarters at 2:31 a.m., 9 minutes after the third contact's final confirmed transmission. The ship returned to standard watch conditions with elevated electronic surveillance posture, the electronic warfare suite maintaining full collection sensitivity on the 031-degree bearing and its surrounding azimuth arc, the FLIR continuing its thermal scan of the northern surface picture, and the surface search radar operating at maximum gain in the sector from which the contacts had emerged. No additional contacts appeared. The damage control inspection ordered at 2:32 a.m. confirmed no hull damage, no fragment impacts on any above-deck structure, and no injuries to personnel. The 2 interceptions had occurred at ranges sufficient to prevent any debris from the detonations reaching the ship. The closest detonation, the second contact at 2.8 nautical miles, had produced a debris scatter that the Morning Light Watch would later record on the FLIR as a floating field of small returns at that range, consistent with the structural components of a fiberglass-hulled unmanned platform dispersed by the RAM's warhead fragmentation pattern. The post-engagement assessment documented the technical picture with the precision that a first documented employment of a new weapons class in this theater required. The three contacts had approached in a loose formation whose spacing, 200 to 300 meters between platforms, was specifically designed to prevent a single interception from generating fragment damage to the adjacent contacts while remaining close enough to present a coordinated simultaneous threat to the defensive picture. The programmed evasion responses observed in the second and third contacts indicated a control software architecture that anticipated interception of the lead element and preloaded course deviation responses for the trailing platforms. The evasion response in the second contact, a 12-degree heading change, had been insufficient to defeat the ram's in-flight guidance update capability. The evasion response in the third contact, a 40-degree heading change combined with acceleration, had been sufficient to exit the approach geometry before a second engagement decision could be made. The control emissions architecture, collected across 6 transmissions from 2:14 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., indicated a range between control station and platform that was consistent with a shore-based or vessel-based control element positioned inside Iranian territorial waters or aboard an IRGC vessel operating north of the cruiser's position. The control station's location was not positively identified from the bearing data alone, but the bearing arc was sufficiently narrow to constrain the search space for any follow-on collection effort. These were the intelligence products that the engagement had generated in addition to the 2 destroyed and 1 recovered to control contacts. Products that would be analyzed, incorporated into the threat picture, and used to update the rules of engagement and tactics, techniques, and procedures for every U.S. Navy vessel operating in the Gulf of Oman for the foreseeable future. Products that had a value measured in the operational decisions they would inform across a threat environment whose character had changed in the hours between 2:14 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. of this particular morning. The costs were enumerated in the maintenance accounting with the same precision as every other element of the engagement record. 2 rolling airframe missiles expended. RAM magazine replenishment required. Before the cruiser's readiness for a repeat engagement of this category could be certified at full capacity, a logistics coordination with the Combined Maritime Forces Support Vessel at Bahrain that would be initiated as the first administrative action following the engagement report. The FLIR's focal array had been operating at maximum sensitivity for an extended period and required a calibration check before the next high-intensity collection requirement. No other material costs. No personnel costs. The human costs that do not appear in a maintenance section were carried by the watch team that had processed a new threat category in real time, made engagement decisions against contacts whose classification was assembled from 3 sensor inputs over 4 minutes rather than from a clean radar track with confirmed identity, and had done so correctly. The second contact's 12-degree evasion had been inside the fire control system's update capability. The third contact's 40-degree evasion had not been engaged because the assessment of its withdrawal was correct, and the intelligence value of tracking it outweighed the tactical value of a third interception. Both decisions had been made in the seconds between sensor reports and engagement authority requests by professionals who had trained for this category of decision and who had produced the right answers when the training became operational reality at 2:18 a.m. in the Gulf of Oman. 3 unmanned surface contacts, 2 intercepts, 1 withdrawal tracked and collected, 6 control system transmissions documented for intelligence analysis, 2 RAM missiles, 14 minutes from first emission to general quarters secured, 0 damage, 0 personnel casualties. The Gulf of Oman has seen every kind of vessel that human beings have put on the water in the last 5 decades. Tankers, warships, fishing boats, fast attack craft, submarines, and now these. Small, quiet, engineered to minimize every signature that standard sensors use to find them. Designed to close a distance that their operators will never close themselves, and to detonate at the end of that distance against a hull they will never see. The vessels that operate in this water have always had to evolve alongside the threats that other vessels brought into it. The cruiser's watch team evolved at 2:14 a.m. The FLIR saw what the radar missed. The electronic warfare suite heard what the FLIR cannot hear. The fire control system solved what neither of them could solve alone. And the RAM did what the entire chain of sensors and decisions had assembled itself to make possible. 2 contacts neutralized, 1 withdrawn and documented. The water is flat and dark again, but the picture of what moved through it between 2:14 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. is now in the intelligence record, and the intelligence record will be read by everyone who needs to understand what the Gulf of Oman has become and what it will take to operate in it tomorrow. At 4:30 a.m., the cruiser's anti-submarine warfare coordinator and electronic warfare officer sat across from each other in the wardroom with the engagement data on a laptop between them, working through the sensor fusion timeline with the methodical attention of professionals who understand that the 14 minutes they had just lived through were going to become a case study. Not because everything went perfectly. The third contact's 40-degree evasion had exposed a gap in the RAM system's engagement envelope against contacts executing combined heading and speed changes simultaneously. A gap that the fire control team had compensated for with a correct assessment decision rather than a corrected technical solution. Gaps compensated for by good decisions are still gaps, and the people who understand them best are the ones who experience them at 2:19 a.m., rather than the ones who will read about them in a doctrine revision document 3 months from now. The debrief ran until 5:45 a.m. The cruiser's commanding officer sat at the head of the table for the last hour of it and said very little, because the professionals across from him were producing the analysis that needed to be produced, and adding his voice to it would have added nothing to the quality of the output. He signed the engagement report at 6:20 a.m. The intelligence annex went to 5th Fleet at 6:35 a.m. The tactical lessons annex went to Naval Surface and Mine Warfighting Development Center at 6:40 a.m., where it would begin its passage through the doctrine revision cycle that would eventually produce updated guidance for every U.S. Navy surface combatant operating in waters where Iranian unmanned surface vessel employment was assessed as a current threat. The Gulf of Oman does not wait for doctrine to catch up to it. It presents the threat and the decision simultaneously, in the dark, at 2:14 a.m., and the watch team either has what it needs or it does not. This watch team had what it needed. 3 sensors, 4 minutes, 2 intercepts, 1 correctly assessed withdrawal, and an intelligence product that will make the next watch team, on the next vessel, on the next deployment, in the same dark water, slightly better prepared for the same moment when it comes again.